Hello, this is Nick Shaw, the senior historian at History Made Simply. Now today we're going to be discussing what some people call the Miracle of Dunkirk. Other people, including Winston Churchill, have other quotes. The other quotes are, in his case, wars are not won by evacuations. Now that was something he said prior to giving his one of his fantastic speeches to cheer the British people up. But anyway, let us go back a bit. When you study military history, one thing becomes abundantly clear. The winners of the last war tend not to improve their armies or navies because they won the last war. Why would they need to? Armies and navies, and of course later air forces, are not led or manned by people with tremendous imaginations. They tend to be people who want to conform and people who want to be told what to do, to be frank. One of the reasons why people join an armed service. Now this applied certainly to the army in 1940 and 1939-1940, the British Army, and it applied to a lesser extent to the Navy and to an even smaller extent to the Royal Air Force, all of whom played an important role in the evacuation of the British Expeditionary Force from Dunkirk. Now, as I've said, winners of wars tend not to spend money updating their army or changing their operational strategies or their tactics. This does not apply to losers. Now, the Germans lost World War I, although many Germans, including most people who were supporters of Adolf Hitler, considered that the loss of the First World War was partially a conspiracy. What do I mean by that? They thought that the ruling elite of Germany would be the large industrialists, people like Krupp, the bankers, who were not entirely but often were Jewish, and to an extent the army, and particularly the navy, were responsible for Germany throwing in the towel and leading to the armistice on November the 11th, 1918. Now it's important to recognise that by this stage the German navy was actually mutinying. What do I mean by that? The German navy could not send its ships to sea because the crews, who in the main slept in barracks near the harbours where their ships were moored, refused to man their ships. You can't man your ships, you can't send your battle cruisers, your battleships, your cruisers, and most importantly by this stage your U-boats to sea. Why did I mention earlier that winners tend not to update their equipment, their tactics and their strategies? Because losers do. Now a good example of this actually is the Crimean War, which took place in the middle of the 19th century and was between Turkey, Britain, France and various other minor players on the European stage, and Russia. Now, nobody had updated their tactics very much since the last major war, which was the war largely waged against Napoleon and the French Empire that he created. The British, indeed, if you'd seen the infantry marching out of Balaclava and towards Sevastopol in 1854-55, frankly, there was little or no difference between them and their predecessors who'd fought 50 years ago in the peninsula, and then later in Belgium and the Low Countries. They were using the same rifle. It wasn't a rifle, it was a musket. They were using the same muskets. They were using, the cavalry were exactly the same. Artillery may have been marginally better, but was still muzzle loading. All of these things were how things had been in 1801 to 1815, fighting and eventually subduing and capturing Napoleon. Why is this important? Because it's not only the Napoleonic Wars, that was then known as the Great War. Of course, after 1914-1918, the First World War became called the Great War. The same was true then. The victors, i.e. France, the UK and the United States, largely thought we won. Did they win? not a single Allied soldier had invaded Germany. In the east, the Germans had won their war against the Russians and were still occupying very large tranches of Poland, parts of the what are now today called the Baltic states, parts of the Ukraine, and small parts of White Russia. In theory, they had entered into a peace treaty with the people now running Russia, which was the Soviet Communist Party, but the Germans had not reacted, had not carried out their part of the peace treaty. They just carried on holding on to the territory they'd held on November the 11th, 1918. So the Germans didn't feel that they were defeated, but they knew that they hadn't won. The British and the Americans and the French thought they'd won, and on the face of it, they had. After November the 11th, the Germans could not realistically have started fighting again. The army just would have, like the navy before it, would have mutinied. In any event, they were turning inwards, and Germany would essentially, from 1918 to 1922, and even into 1923, would fall into a state of what would be called revolution, because they had been defeated by democracies. Well, that was the French, the British and the Americans. They hadn't been defeated on the Eastern Front by either a military dictatorship or a communist state, both of which were not part of the First World War, the fighting of the First World War. They had defeated an autocratic empire which had a figure who was semi-divine called the Tsar, running really from whom all power flowed. The same, of course, might be said of Japan, also a partaker in World War I on the Allied side, and indeed of all the countries that took part in World War I, Japan benefited the most in terms of acquisition of new territory in relation to naval and army losses, which were very, very small indeed. Anyway, let us go back to this concept of losers and winners, the end of a big war. One of the things the losers do is they are normally subjected to a rather onerous peace treaty. This was certainly the case at the end of the First World War. The German army was reduced from a multi-million manpower situation to no more than 100,000 regular troops. They weren't allowed any tanks, they weren't allowed any aircraft. The German Navy was not allowed any battleships, and particularly not allowed any submarines. Neither the German Army nor the German Navy were allowed an air force. So the Germans, in effect, were legally stuck. They were stuck in 1914, actually, because it wasn't until much later in the First World War that air forces had become an important factor, and it certainly wasn't until much later in the First World War that undersea warfare became very important. Anyway, so the Germans, in effect, militarily turned inwards, working out why they had lost and what could they have done to counteract it. Well, they weren't allowed any tanks. So obviously, if you turn around to a defeated country and say, well, you can't have tanks, you can't have aeroplanes, one of the first things they're going to start doing is researching how to make the best tanks and how to make a modern air force. That is precisely what the Germans did. They were able, because the Soviet Union required military expertise, they were able to do a deal with the Russians, and they were able to build tanks in Russia, which they then practiced with. Now, one of the key features of World War I was that the massive casualties, military casualties, fell on particular groups of people. They were all young, but if you'd been an infantry officer, a junior infantry officer actually fighting in the trenches, chances of survival were at best, on average, measured in months, but often when an offensive was underway, whether you were defending or attacking, their life expectancy dropped to weeks rather than months. And indeed, the Germans were very lucky in that one of their best young fighting soldiers, Erwin Rommel, survived World War I. A rather important figure in World War II, Adolf Hitler, survived. He was what was called a runner in World War I. In other words, he was attached to a signals company, and he ran delivering messages, either verbally or pieces of paper. Now, Hitler was injured at the end of World War I, and indeed had been rendered partially blind he was in hospital on November the 11th, 1918, and it would be some time before he got out of hospital. Anyway, the professional corps of the German army, which again had been rendered illegal by the Treaty of Versailles, that is the general staff. In theory, the Germans were not allowed to have a general staff, but in practice, it was very hard for them. It was very hard for the Allies to enforce this aspect of the Treaty of Versailles. So the Germans did have a general staff, and because the German army was probably the most professional army on the planet, even after the armistice in 1918, they methodically examined why they had lost World War I and how they would need to fashion a new army that could win the next war. Now, they didn't expect the next war to be anything like World War I, the Great War as it was called at the time. What they expected was what had gone before the Great War, what military historians call cabinet wars, in that one national entity takes on another national entity and doesn't allow that national entity to draw in loads of other partners. And indeed, if we start the Second World War, came to be called the Second World War, really we should be starting it in the very early 1930s, when the Japanese invaded China. And indeed, by the mid-1930s, war was raging. At the same time, a new type of state had grown up in and around the Mediterranean. Italy had become a fascist dictatorship. It still had some trappings of the sort of militarised state that existed in Central and Southern Europe before the First World War, because it had a largish army, but it now had a competent navy, and to the end of the 1930s, a very well-equipped navy, and it had the new boy on the block, an air force. Now, unfortunately, their air force by 1939 was suffering from what air forces did everywhere: obsolescence. The speed of development technically in air power in the decade of the 1930s was unbelievable. If you'd looked at the air forces of Britain, France, the hidden air force of Germany, and the Russians in 1929, it would have not looked a great deal different from that prevailed in 1918. By 1935, these air forces, indeed the air forces of every major industrialised state, were changing unbelievably rapidly. Gone were the biplanes of all sizes, which had characterised the air forces of World War I. They were not very fast. They could do 190, 250 miles an hour if they were fighters, slower if they were bombers or reconnaissance planes. Entirely new concepts had come into being. Paratroops, the first country really to develop paratroops, was the Soviet Union. But once Hitler came to power, and his ambition to acquire Lebensraum, that's living space, became apparent, and he realised he would have to defeat this modernising military force inside the Soviet Union. He realised that the development of new weapons, new tactics, and consequently new strategies had to follow. Otherwise, they would stand no chance of overrunning the western parts of the Soviet Union. And that is what happened. There was what today we would call an arms race. And indeed, an arms race had taken place before World War I. Largely, it was navies that took part in this arms race. But that's another story, but it's a very good early example of changing technologies forcing rapid increases in expenditure on new weapon systems. In the case of the arms race before World War I, we're talking about battleships, battle cruisers, which suddenly became, after the building and launching of a British battleship called the Dreadnought, the Dreadnought essentially rendered all current hulls of all navies obsolete because it was armed with bigger guns, and it could travel much faster through the water, and it was reasonably well armoured. Normally speaking, at that stage, you could either travel fast, be well armoured, or have big guns. You couldn't have all three. Let's go back to the run-up to the Second World War. So the Germans were developing land forces that were fundamentally different from the land forces that had engaged in war in 1914. Although this applied to only about a quarter of the German army, the bulk of the German army, 75% of it, remained much, not entirely, but much as the German army and the French army had at the beginning of World War I. In other words, most soldiers, most infantry marched on their own feet to battle. They were serviced by largely horse-drawn equipment. It was horses that were pulling their field artillery, horses that were pulling wagons filled with their supplies and replacement ammunition. Yes, there were now some trucks. What they weren't were four-wheel drive trucks. But about a quarter of the German army was mechanised and motorised properly. And it was this portion of the German army that would transform the battlefield in 1939 and 1940 and develop a system of battle fighting which came to be called Blitzkrieg. What a Blitzkrieg actually involved was inter-army air force cooperation on an organised, at every level, scale, and motorised and mechanised forces, that's infantry carried in trucks that either were four-wheel drive or trucks that were half truck, that's the front bit, and had the same arrangement as tanks had. Now, one of the advantages of a half track, which is what that is called, that is front two wheels to steer, and then, in effect, a tractor on the back. Not all tractors were merely made up of wheels or driven by wheels. Tractors also had the sort of tracks that we associate with tanks, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, where it's a lot muddier than it is in, for example, France or Great Britain. Anyway, so the Germans now had about 25% of their army was mechanised and motorised. They were able to mechanise and motorise more of it as they overran new and currently neutral countries. So, for example, by the spring of 1939, the Germans had, in effect, swallowed Czechoslovakia. Now, Czechoslovakia was described by the then British Prime Minister as a far country of which we knew little. Well, had he consulted British military intelligence, he would have discovered that Czechoslovakia produced 10% of the world's output of weapons, largely from factories run by a company called Skoda, which today we're familiar with because of the rather cheap cars that they produce. Well, one of the things they were producing in 1938 and 39 was tanks. This enabled the Germans to equip more of their motorised divisions, convert their motorised divisions into mechanised divisions. A German Panzer division, which is an armoured division, at the start of World War II had between 120 and 150 tanks as its basic, if you like, hitting weapon. It also had several hundred armoured cars. It had some self-propelled artillery, and it had some motorised or mechanised infantry regiments. In other words, it wasn't just tanks, it was an all-arms mechanised stroke motorised unit. What does that mean? Well, it means that actually the Germans are advancing with a mixture that can take on any form of defence. Your tanks, if your linear defence, which is of course the sort of defence that the British, the French, later the Russians, the Dutch and the Belgians indulged in, well, you can go around it, can't you? If you've got tanks, you can break through at a weak spot in the enemy's lines, and you can encircle them from the rear. The Germans, and in particular the German General Staff, was obsessed with a battle fought by Hannibal in the Second Punic War, i.e. this is well before the birth of Christ. It was called Cannae. And what happened at Cannae was what was called a double envelopment. In other words, essentially what Hannibal did at Cannae was he withdrew his forces in the centre of his line, encouraging the Roman legions to come in. He fed some more forces to each flank, and as the Romans advanced, Hannibal's flanks advanced in the other direction, eventually joining hands behind the Roman army and encircling them. Now, the Roman army at Cannae is reckoned to have amounted to some 25,000 to 40,000 troops. The complete encirclement of this army ensured that less than 500 of these troops escaped alive. Now, this is one of the most tactically decisive battles in history, and it's hardly surprising that the academically driven German army was immensely intrigued by this, and, if you like, based their operational strategy on the Battle of Cannae. In other words, they wanted to cut off and encircle their opponents and force them eventually into a pocket, if you like. Almost all important battles of World War II, including the breakout from Normandy in 1944, involve encircling the enemy forces in front of you and squeezing them into a smaller and smaller pocket. On a large scale, this is how the first phase of the destruction of the Western Allies in the spring and early summer of 1940 by the Wehrmacht, the German army, and the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. That's how it took place. This was only phase one of the complete destruction of the British and French forces. Stage two was after Dunkirk, which we'll come on to shortly, where they had taken the best French parts of the French army off the field, as it were, and the British army, again, man for man, the British army was much better armed and equipped to fight a modern war than the French army was. They'd been essentially eliminated from the battlefield. How? We'll come on to that now. So the Germans had a plan in the winter of 1939, which was very similar to the famous plan that they used in the spring and summer of 1914, which was called the Schlieffen Plan. This was an invasion through the Low Countries, essentially to cut off Paris from the rest of France, and encircle Paris, pin the armed forces inside the still open circle that they were creating against the Maginot Line, the back of the Maginot Line, this would then force the French to surrender. And largely that is what happened. So what was the situation on May the 9th, 1940? Why May the 9th? This was the day before the Germans started their blitzkrieg invasion of Holland, Luxembourg, Belgium and France. What was the situation? Well, on the face of it, the Germans did not look particularly strong. They had tanks, they had aircraft, they had artillery, and they had lots of infantry. However, so did the French. And just looking at the sort of raw numbers, the French army and the German army were roughly equivalent in terms of combat manpower. The French had more planes and had not indulged in minor fringe attacks, which had reduced their combat, the face value combat power of their air force. They had more and better tanks than the Germans did, and their artillery was probably unsurpassed by any in the world. In addition, they had the Maginot Line. What was the Maginot Line? The Maginot Line was a line of defences, the sort of defences that had the French and the British been on the back foot in the autumn and winter of 1918, the sort of defences they would have constructed to fall back on in 1919. This comes back to the concept that the winners were looking backwards and the losers were looking forwards in terms of the Army, Air Force and indeed Navy that they were crafting for the future. So on May the 10th, 1940, the Germans began their massive attack on the Low Countries and France. Now, as I've said, the German army and the French army were more or less equivalent. However, the German army was not just facing the French army, they were facing the British Expeditionary Force, which consisted of 12 divisions, all of which were motorised. There were no actual... There were tanks, and indeed one of the tanks that the British fielded, the Matilda, was certainly the equal of most German tanks. The Germans at this stage had Panzers 1 and 2. They had quite large numbers of those, and they had the Panzer 3. They did not as yet have the Panzer 4, which would be the mainstay of the German army throughout World War II. So, in addition, of course, there was also the Belgian army and the relatively small, but nevertheless not unimportant, Dutch army. Luxembourg, I think we can more or less put to one side. So, on the face of it, if you just looked at the numbers, the Germans were in fact outnumbered. Now, at this time, it was normally reckoned that the person carrying out the attacks, if they expected the attacks to be successful, needed odds of 3-1 in their favour. In other words, the Germans should have had 3 times the numbers of the enemies that they were attacking. They didn't. They barely had parity. However, what we can say is 25% of the German army was much better equipped, trained, and had come up with new tactics to, if you like, enhance their combat power well above the actual numbers that they had. What do I mean by this? Well, as I say, the losers of a war, and in this case the Germans had been the losers, they need to develop, they're much more likely to develop new weapons and new methods of employing those weapons to win the next war. The Germans had therefore invested in armoured equipment, tanks, armoured personnel carriers, armoured cars to scout. They also had, for example, the military version of the Volkswagen, which was another sign of the change in military power. Military power now depended on mass production, not on very good, very well made, but only available in small quantities types of weapons. So the Germans began their blitzkrieg on May the 10th, 1940, and it appeared to be that the main thrust was extremely similar to the Schlieffen Plan. The Schlieffen Plan, remember, involved attacking through Belgium and Luxembourg into northern France, and then encircling Paris and pinning the armies against their armies that were also up in Alsace-Lorraine and the Rhineland. Now, actually, the invasion of Holland, Belgium and Luxembourg was what might be called a blind. Yes, it was important, and yes, an entire army group, that's at least 30 divisions, was involved in the invasion of Belgium, Holland and Luxembourg. But unbeknownst to the French and the British and the armies of the Low Countries, this was, if you like a matador flapping its cape to distract the bull, because the main, what the Germans call in military terms the Schwerpunkt, this is the point of maximum effort, was at a place the French considered to be impassable to motorised and mechanised forces. This is the wooded, hilly, indeed mountainous in places countryside of the Ardennes. This is an area which is bordered by Luxembourg, Belgium and France and Germany. And this was where their main effort was coming. Now, the German plan was quite simple. Encourage the good bits, that's the British Expeditionary Force and most of the French armoured and mechanised units, to advance into Belgium to defend the Belgians and even to a lesser extent to defend the Dutch, and then send the bulk of their armoured forces through the Ardennes, which they considered would be doable, and then those forces were to head for the Channel. What would this do? This would cut off the good bits of the Allied forces from the bulk of their supplies and the bulk of their army. Because north of the line the Germans' main force was going to take, there were only two really good ports, Antwerp and Rotterdam. There were other ports, Ostend, for example, Calais and Dunkirk, but these were relatively small affairs. The British, for example, were bringing in most of their supplies via Le Havre, which is at the mouth of the Seine, so it's much further south. Now, this doesn't mean that the British Army, which wasn't vast, but it was still about 400,000 troops at the outset, it doesn't mean that the British Army couldn't have been supplied via Antwerp, Rotterdam, Ostend, Calais and Dunkirk, but it would have been more difficult because they didn't have the port infrastructure to handle the level of supplies that 400,000 plus men required. Or rather, the ports I've mentioned, those being the ones being north of the line the Germans were planning to establish. As long as you kept Antwerp and Rotterdam, you probably could have done it. But Antwerp and Rotterdam fell very quickly into German hands and more or less intact. This then left us with Ostend, Dunkirk and Calais. and to a lesser extent Boulogne as well. Boulogne and Calais were largely fishing ports. Dunkirk, yes, was an industrial port, no question about that. Ostend, again, fishing, tourism, and of course there were ferries. The ferry business went through Boulogne, Calais and Ostend into northwest France and Belgium and Holland, and then on into Germany. So really, if the British lost Antwerp and Rotterdam and the Germans succeeded in reaching the Channel, which they did, the British forces and the elite part of the French army were trapped now north of this line. In other words, in effect, shall we say, north of the Somme, right? They were north of the Somme. South of the Somme was still held by the bulk of the remainder of the French army. The entirety of the Maginot Line was still in the hands of the French. So it looked difficult, didn't look like a disaster. Well, what turned it into a disaster? Well, as we've said, they lost control of Antwerp, they lost control of Rotterdam, and really they were unable to supply the British army and indeed the French army that was trapped north of this line that started in the Ardennes and went west to the Channel. Also, by this time, the French and indeed the British were becoming bewildered by the new operational tactics that the Germans had adopted. The French would decide on a stop line, looking at their maps in Paris. They would communicate with their forces in the north. They would form this stop line only to find that the Germans had already outflanked it and were behind them. And this happened relentlessly. Anyway, come the third week of the battle, i.e. the 23rd, 24th, 25th of May 1940, the British were, all bar one division which was serving in the Maginot Line, the 12 divisions of the British Expeditionary Force were gradually being forced into a pocket. That pocket consisted of Calais, Dunkirk, Ostend, and some other minor fishing ports and tourist ports, for want of a better word. The Germans were pushing the rest of the French army away. Now, that was a counterattack launched by a hastily put together French armoured division commanded by a young general called de Gaulle, and a British armoured division or armoured force which took place around Amiens, but it failed. It failed completely, largely because the principal German formation they encountered was the 7th Panzer Division, which was commanded by a young general called Rommel. Now, Rommel improvised. He used his tanks defensively very well. He used the 88mm anti-aircraft gun in an anti-tank role with tremendous effect, and he effectively blunted what was an inadequately resourced force, the British coming from the north and the French coming from the south-east. So what could the British do? Well, first of all, problems began to rain down on the British generals who were in charge of the British Expeditionary Force. Firstly, the Dutch surrendered, Luxembourg was overrun, eastern Belgium, including the capital Brussels, were overrun, and in the last days of May, the Belgian army surrendered. Now, this meant the British army had to indulge in some tremendously complex manoeuvres to maintain a front, to fill the gaps caused by the surrender of the Belgian army. These gaps were filled because the divisional commander responsible for moving at night his entire division 50 miles was one Bernard Law Montgomery, and his corps commander was General Allenbrook. General Allenbrook would later become Lord Allenbrook. He would become a field marshal, and he would become Chief of the Imperial General Staff, i.e. the head of the professional head of the British Army, and I would suggest the mind that was largely responsible for winning the war in the West against Nazi Germany. Anyway, both these men and the officer who went on to become Field Marshal Alexander, other corps commanders, Horrocks, Dempsey. Dempsey was an army commander in 1944. Many other good British generals were all about to go into the bag, as it were. They would have ended up in a German prisoner of war camp had what came to be called the Miracle of Dunkirk not happened. Okay, so what did happen then? Well, the British realised that they had to hold on to Ostend, Calais and Dunkirk if they were to stand any chance of getting their forces into a defensive posture so that they could hold on to a pocket of northern France and southern Belgium. But the Germans were relentless. The German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, dominated the skies. The German army was simply too good for the British, French and originally Belgian forces. And by the time we were down to the British and the French forces, the Germans had become overwhelmed. The positions they were occupying on the battlefield were such that the British and French were now unable to resupply their forces north of the German breakthrough line. Now, the British being somewhat pessimistic, the British Chief of the General Staff at that point, a general named Ironside, being extremely pessimistic, had already by the third week of May begun to pull back some British forces. By that I mean pull back to the UK. The French were clamouring for large numbers of British fighter aircraft to come to France. At the moment, i.e. around the 20th of May, the fighter forces in France, the British fighter forces, consisted of the Hurricane, the Defiant, which was a complete disaster of a two-engined fighter, and a light bomber called the Fairy Battle, which, frankly, it would have been the best thing to do would have been to shot every other member of their aircrew and burnt the lot of them. Unfortunately, it was worse. The reality was worse than that. And we'll come on to that in a minute. So the good bits of the British Air Force, i.e. the fighter squadrons manned by Spitfires, and the rest of the Hurricane force were back in Britain. And the head of fighter command, Sir Hugh Dowding, was relentlessly refusing to send more fighters to France because he could see what was going to happen. He could see that the British and French forces had little or no chance of defeating Germany in the field, and that eventually the French would be knocked out of the war and Britain would have to stand alone. Now, he had calculated that he could probably defend southern, central and northern England and South Wales, which was as far as the Luftwaffe would be able to get if they were operating from the coast of France. He reckoned he could defend the country with 55 Spitfire and Hurricane fighter squadrons. That is exactly what he'd got. That's why he didn't want to send any more to France, because if he sent them to France, would they come back? Well, the answer is that very few of the Hurricane fighters that had fought in the defence of France in May 1940, they didn't come back. A few did. More pilots came back, and they would be helpful. What would be more helpful, of course, was the fact that the Germans gave us the balance of June and all of July before they really started what came to be called the Battle of Britain. But that's another story. Anyway, let's go back to the position as it was around the 20th of May. So around the 20th of May, the British were cut off, had some thoughts with their French allies of being able to open up a channel between the two parts of the Allied forces, i.e. those north of the German breakthrough and those to the south of the German breakthrough. One thing was clear, that if this wasn't resolved quickly in the Allied favour, it would become increasingly difficult to defend the ground north of the German breakthrough, because supplies would not get through to them. So once, for example, their field artillery and medium artillery had fired off the shells that they got, there'd be no more. Once the fighters, this would be largely the British fighters, the French Air Force took little or no part in the defence of its own country. Once the British fighters, Hurricanes, and some Defiants, had used up their ammo and their aviation fuel, they would disappear from the board, as it were, and the British and French would be down to their infantry moving on their feet. So the Germans effectively solidified their breakthrough from the Ardennes to the English Channel north of the Somme by the 20th of May. 10 days, 10 to 14 days, they had completely solidified and stopped any opportunity for the British forces north of that line and the British and French forces north of that line, and the French forces south of that line, punching a hole in the line. They simply were north of the line. The supply situation was poor and getting worse every day. South of the line, there just wasn't the combat power. There weren't the tanks. Most of the tanks were north of the line. So it became increasingly difficult. Also, the Germans were able to free up much of the 25% of their army that was motorised and mechanised and replace it with infantry divisions. The infantry divisions were well equipped with field artillery and anti-tank gun artillery. So they could stop an armoured assault, even supposing the Allies could have mounted an effective support. Now, if you want to know more about this aspect of the Dunkirk campaign, I would advise you to get hold of a book by Britain's leading live battlefield commander. And his name is Major General Julian Thompson. And he's not an army general, he's a Royal Marines general. And Julian Thompson was, in fact, responsible for most of the ground fighting in the Falklands War. He had ensured that the Argentinians would be defeated. It wasn't any longer in overall command when they were defeated, but he really was responsible. Now, one of the things I would like to say is that there have been several, apart from some wonderful documentaries about Dunkirk, there are also very good two very good films. One made by Ealing Studios in black and white in the 1950s, which covers things pretty well, in my opinion. And then we have a much bigger film from 2017, directed by Christopher Nolan, arguably Britain's current leading film director. But he goes too far down the chain of command. he looks at things entirely from the infantryman's point of view and from the air point of view. He looks at the operations of one Spitfire. Why a Spitfire when I've just said that actually they were using Hurricanes? Well, one of the advantages and one of the reasons we were successful in evacuating very large numbers of the British Expeditionary Force and over 100,000 Frenchmen as well. In fact, the total number of evacuees was between 330 and 350,000, and that was carried out entirely from the 26th of May until the 4th of June. It's not a very long time, is it? 30 days have September, April, June and November. So that's 5 days in May and 4 days in June, so 9 days. That's all the time that there was to carry out the evacuation of Dunkirk. So if you want to know about the fighting in the run-up to Dunkirk, to the actual evacuation, as I say, you need to look at a book by Julian Thompson, Major General in the Marines, called Dunkirk, Retreat to Victory. You can get this as a hardback, paperback, if you hunt about, but it's available as a Kindle. Now, if you can afford to buy it as a paperback, that is what I would suggest you do. Because one of the problems about reading military history, modern military history, is you need to refer to tables and maps that are inevitably included in the books. And doing that on a Kindle ain't easy, however good you are with Kindle. So I can see here the cheapest is, you're going to get the Dunkirk Retreat to Victory by Julian Thompson is $6.99. A very good investment if you are more interested in this campaign than this talk gives, the information that is given to you in this talk. Anyway, and there's another book I'll mention at the end as well. Anyway, so the British were and the good bits of the French army were being squeezed into this narrow pocket, which was reduced by the third week of May to, if you like, a baseline from Calais to Ostend. By the end of the third week of May, it had been reduced to Dunkirk and Calais, and there was a vicious little battle between a British infantry brigade, that's about 4,000 men, and several German panzer divisions, that's their tank division, so that would have been a couple of hundred German tanks, over Calais. Now Calais has got quite good defences. Admittedly, they're from the 19th century, but there was like what could be called a fort, and that was the basis of the defence of Calais. By this stage, Churchill and the British Chiefs of Staff had realised that there was no hope of breaking out and moving south to rejoin the bulk of the French army. So he insisted that the brigadier in Calais fought more or less to the last man, which he was commanding a professional British brigade, largely made up of long-term professional soldiers and some territorial soldiers who were also highly committed to fighting. And they did hold out for a couple of days. This enabled the British to organise the perimeter defences around Dunkirk. Why around Dunkirk and not Dunkirk and Ostend? They'd lost Ostend by that time as well. So there was now a reasonably well fortified perimeter around the port of Dunkirk. Now the port of Dunkirk is, like most other ports on the Channel coast of France, it's man-made. Yes, you could run a small fishing fleet, and indeed Dunkirk was famous in the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries for smugglers and pirates. They were called, but of course they weren't pirates, because most of the time in the 17th, 18th and 19th century, early 19th century anyway, we were fighting the French at sea. So you could turn from being a pirate to being a auxiliary of the French Navy by getting what were called letters of marque. And there were lots of small, well-armed, overmanned sailing ships coming out of Dunkirk and picking up British merchant ships in all the wars of the 18th, 17th and 18th century. So that was the 9 Years' War, 1690 to 1699, the War of the Spanish Succession, which was 1702 to 1714, the War of the Austrian Succession, that went on mainly through the 1740s, the 7 Years' War, which is mid-1750s to 1763, the War of the American Revolution, where there was certainly plenty of naval activity in the Channel and in the North Sea. Again, French privateers operating under letters of marque used Dunkirk as their main base in that period. And finally, we deal with the French Revolutionary Wars, 1792 to 1801, and the Napoleonic War, 1803 to 1815, in effect. Although there wasn't much naval activity in the final phase, i.e. the 100 Days campaign, which ended up with Napoleon surrendering to the Royal Navy. Anyway, so you can see that Dunkirk as a port is tactically quite important, but it couldn't really cope with very large ships, and it certainly couldn't have repaired, for example, cruisers, destroyers, and French battleships or battle cruisers, of which the French had some. So how were the British 400,000 men or thereabouts going to escape? Well, propaganda at the time suggested it was because of very large numbers of very small ships, known as the little ships. This would be everything from a cabin cruiser up to which normally would have operated in the Thames or maybe the Medway, to any other form of civilian ship or boat. So, for example, the Isle of Wight ferries pressed into service. The ferries that operate on the Kent coast, operate on the Essex coast, and operated in the Thames estuary. They were all pressed into use quickly and efficiently, because when Churchill realised that he would have to organise an evacuation, he went to a rather competent admiral, who was the admiral in charge of Dover, called Admiral Ramsay. Now, Admiral Ramsay operated from bunkers underneath Dover Castle, and the main room where his planning staff operated from had formerly contained the dynamos which provided the underground complex and Dover Castle with its electricity. And so his staff, who were organising the evacuation, were operating out of the dynamo room. Hence the reason why the whole operation came to be called Operation Dynamo. And astoundingly, 350,000 plus Allied troops, that was, because we took the French off as well, came back from Dunkirk. This is an enormous number. Now, as I said, propaganda at the time and subsequently would tend for you to think that they mainly came back off the beaches. Lots did come back off the beaches, but a lot more came off what was called the East Mole. This was part of the outer French harbour, which was a man-made sea wall, on which had a walkway above it, which created a much larger harbour with a mole on the other side. And that much larger harbour was what was needed because the area immediately inside the country, behind Dunkirk, was quite heavily industrialised. And the industrial products, that was chemicals, metals, needed to be moved out in bulk. And that bulk went through the port of Dunkirk. Much the same could be said, for example, of Calais, although Calais was smaller, and much the same could be said of Boulogne, and definitely it could be said of Le Havre. None of these are particularly wonderful natural harbours. They're all man-made. Going back to our wars with France in the 17th and 18th and early 19th centuries, one of the key strategic reasons why we could probably win these was because we had very, very good natural harbours on the south coast of Britain, bordering the English Channel. We had Portsmouth, we had Southampton, we had Poole, and we had Plymouth, all of which were excellent natural harbours. Anyway, and they were very useful because you could disembark troops being brought out of France back through those very large natural ports. Anyway, back to Dunkirk. So how did most of the 350,000 plus British and French troops get lifted off? Well, they got lifted off this mole, this long sea wall, where there was deep water through all the tides. There was deep water quite a long way in on this mole, and you could bring quite large ships, certainly up to the level of a destroyer, or Isle of Wight ferries, operating off the Kent coast, ferries operating off the Essex coast, and ferries operating from in the Thames estuary, all could be brought to the moles, and you could get a load of troops onto them. What you couldn't do was get their armoured vehicles, their trucks, and their artillery and supplies on. You get troops on, and that's what we did. So the very first thing we should say is the British lost 65,000 vehicles in the evacuation at Dunkirk. They lost thousands of pieces of field artillery and medium artillery. They lost the bulk of the tanks that the British had in total. And of course they lost aircraft as well. They would also go on to lose a number of destroyers, I think about 10 destroyers were lost. And believe you me, destroyers were what, once Britain stood alone, destroyers were critical to Britain's survival. Anyway, so the evacuation was mainly, in terms of manpower, was mainly from this eastern mole, and it finished on the 4th of June. Now, funnily enough, although I've criticised Christopher Nolan's 2017 movie, one of the things that is well covered in that is the evacuation from the mole. As I say, in fact, he tends to largely ignore completely. There is one example of a small British motorboat. Now, obviously, from a dramatic point of view, a small boat lifting 20 troops off the beach at Dunkirk is much more dramatically exciting than 600 troops being lifted off by a destroyer off the mole. And if you like, the first Dunkirk film does tend to concentrate on that. So all power to Christopher Nolan. The second Dunkirk film makes it abundantly clear that most British troops have got away, and French troops as well, got away from the mole. So, as Churchill was to say on the floor of the House of Commons, wars weren't won by evacuations. But what were the plus sides from the British, and indeed, in the long term, the French point of view? First of all, the French got back about 100,000 troops straight away, which in theory ought to have enabled them to defend the balance of their country south of the Somme pretty well. It didn't. As I've said, the British lost 65,000 plus vehicles, but frankly, most of those vehicles weren't worth having. They weren't, if they were trucks, they were too small, and they weren't four-wheel drive. Britain bought a lot of replacement trucks from Detroit. They were four-wheel drive. So what were the pluses from the British point of view, apart from they were forced to re-equip their armies with more modern, more contemporary equipment? Well, they got back some pretty good generals. They got back Montgomery, they got back Allenbrook, they got back Alexander, they got back Horrocks, they got back Dempsey. They got back loads and loads of good senior and middle-ranking commanders who would go on to win the ground war from June 1944 to May 1945. More importantly, perhaps, they got back a very large number, many tens of thousands, of non-commissioned officers. The backbone of any modern army is its non-commissioned officers. They know how to do everything. They can take the shopkeeper, the postman, the milkman, et al., and they can train them to be good soldiers. Not something that generals can do. Generals can set the tone, and generals can plan what to do with all these troops. And of course, we got back 300,000 plus, well no, 275,000 plus infantry and armoured personnel. Plus, of course, the logistic troops. Now, the logistic troops were probably the luckiest. They got out first if they were servicing the British Army from Le Havre, Boulogne, Calais and Ostend. When the writing being on the wall from about the 20th of May, they were quietly evacuated anyway. But the point was that the 250,000 men plus, British troops plus, who were brought back to the UK from Dunkirk, formed what's called a cadre. A cadre is the basis for the new army. All that was left in Britain was a force, one armoured division that wasn't ready for combat, and maybe 10 infantry brigades. There weren't any paratroops, even under training. Commandos didn't exist, special forces didn't exist. All that would come much later in the British recovery from Dunkirk. Dunkirk marked the low point, but it also was the basis, it was the baseline for the recovery for D-Day. Right, well, I think we've covered Dunkirk. If you have any queries or questions, feel free to email us. Thank you very much for listening.